Welcome to Virtual Agile Meetings, everyone. It's great to have you all along. Quite a few people online. Tonight we've got Daniel Ploeg, who's going to be talking about Kanban. And I know there's quite a few meetup organisers online as well. So just go around each of you, tell us who you are and who your group is. And yeah, who wants to go first?
So David Williams here. So representing the Melbourne Lean Coffee, all things Agile and anything else that takes your fancy. So come along on a Tuesday morning. There's also another one on a Thursday morning.
Great, Daniel.
Yeah, myself, I'm obviously going to be presenting today, but I'm also representing the Melbourne Kanban meetup as well as the Sydney Limited Whip Society. And I think it's the first meetup event for the Sydney Limited Whip Society, I think in a couple of years. So welcome back.
Great, thanks Daniel. And we've got Silky, do you want to go next?
Yes, here I am. Hi, but I'm on my phone. It's a bit different than being on my laptop. Yeah, so I'm Silke, and I've got the Wellington Limited Whip meetup. And it's pretty cool because we've got this limited meetup really all over the world. And so we've got the Wellington one in New Zealand. And yeah, I'm quite excited because I met Daniel last month, just two weeks before lockdown, I think, in Melbourne. And we had a really cool chat. And then we were thinking about doing things together between Wellington and Australia in the Kanban world. And it's pretty awesome because like this lockdown is forcing us to go different ways. And I think it's actually pretty cool. I really enjoy, for example, to join the European meetups nowadays. And it's really cool because the world is getting even smaller. Yeah.
That's okay. And Will?
Hi there. Hi from Perth, Australia. So Daniel kindly sent me over a link, so I thought I'd come and check out this virtual event. So really pleased to be here, and thank you for the invite.
Welcome. Which group are you with? Which organisation?
Sorry, from Agile Perth.
Agile Perth, great. Anyone else, or I think that was it, everybody? Yeah, anyone else?
Ian, it's Jo Stevenson. I'll represent Women in Agile Melbourne Group tonight.
Oh, good to have you along, Jo.
Hey, thank you.
And we also
started. Sorry, another one?
Yeah, sorry, Ian. There was an apology from Frank Vassallo, who was going to come along, but he was going to represent the Adelaide Agile Meetup group as well. So we may actually have some folks in from Adelaide as well.
Great, welcome everyone. So I'll just read a quick intro about Daniel, and then I'll hand over to Daniel. You can take it away. And actually, Daniel, we spoke before. You said you were happy to have questions as we go, weren't you? So yeah, sure. So guys, just jump in
for questions. If you don't want to go on audio, just ask it through the chat group.
Yeah. So Daniel Ploeg is an accredited Kanban consultant and trainer through Kanban University. He's an experienced leader in Agile software delivery and product development. He helps organizations unleash their potential by facilitating new and innovative ways of thinking and working. He runs his own consultancy and training business, Evogility, based in Melbourne, Australia. Daniel's going to be talking about Kanban and the basics. There you go, Daniel. Over to you.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much. I've given this talk a couple of times over the years, and at various last conferences and I guess brown bag sessions at various companies. And it's always interesting because whenever we run it maybe once a year for the Melbourne Kanban meetup, and there's always about 10 or 20 people coming along to learn some of the basics, and it's great to have all of the new beginners coming online, but we've also got some others that have got some more expertise as well. So it's great to have a variety of people with different levels of knowledge, but this is really directed at people who are just beginning with Kanban, who really don't know what it is and want to get more of a basic understanding. And I even find quite often talking to a number of Agile coaches out there in the community, even the level of knowledge with Agile coaches, you know, sometimes is actually quite low as to what Kanban really is. So hopefully I can dispel a few myths and talk through some of the basics and get everyone onto the same page as to what some of those basics really are. Okay. So, okay. All right. So we've talked a little bit about me, and yeah, as Ian mentioned, I'm accredited through Kanban University. But a little bit more about my history. I first came, I guess I first found Kanban years ago. I was in a training session with Mary and Tom Poppendick about 8 or 10 years ago. It's probably about 10 years ago now. And they were doing a session on lean leadership. And Mary said, hey, there's this great new blue book that's come out. Everyone should check it out. I've actually got a copy still kicking around over here. She said, go out and get it and check it out. And so I did. And I was hooked from there on. And then in about 2015, I did a course with David Anderson, who wrote the book, and found out a lot more about Kanban, and realized there's a lot more depth to Kanban and understanding it than I ever imagined. And so that's why I really like doing this thing for beginners, is to, I guess, help people start on that journey. And hopefully they'll see a lot more depth that'll help them through their careers and help them you know, deliver more successful outcomes for their companies and their customers. Okay, yeah, and I've been accredited consultant and trainer for the last sort of, well, 5 and 3 years for each of them. Okay, what a lot of people don't realise is that there's a big umbrella of Agile out there in lots of different areas, Kanban is really, I guess, a management method for greatly improving service delivery. And I think that's quite distinctive from a number of the other Agile practices, is that it focuses on managing the work and let the workers self-organize around it. But it's really about management, because I remember in the early days of Agile, you know, near 20 years ago, is there was almost I guess a rebellion against the ideas of some of the traditional management. Sorry, there was a question. The book is the blue book is Kanban. It's the Kanban blue book. There's a link to the back of it in my slides. It's David Anderson is the author. So thanks. Abdullah just put a link on there. Thanks, mate. Yeah. So what's really great about Kanban is, you know, it's quite distinctive in that it's a way to help manage work. And it does that by actually catalyzing improvements. And we see this a lot in Agile, where in some areas people say it shines a light on the problems. But I think Kanban does a little bit more than shining a light on it. It actually also highlights the need for the improvement, the demand or the reason for the improvement. Was there a question there? No. I might ask, if you don't have a question, can you please go on mute, because otherwise we'll get a lot of background noise for the folks that are on the call. Thank you. And ideally, you know, what we want to do is try and evolve your business to be more fit for your customers' purposes. And what your customers' purposes are now might be very different to what they are in 5 years' time, or 3 years' time even, or even less time. You know, we see that right now. The changes that are really apparent in today's workplace and marketplace is never been so apparent as what it is perhaps this year. And continually evolving and trying to be fit for purpose. And I'll give you an example at the end of today's session as to how even those in the world of Kanban has evolved a lot. So when David first wrote this book about 10 years ago, there's been quite a number of works done in the field of Kanban, and it's evolved substantially since where it was when it first began way back when. Okay. This is also something that I really like about Kanban. It's one of the things that really drew me to it. I guess it really also distinguished itself from some of the other agile ways of working, if you like, is the notion of evolutionary change and this idea that you start with where you are now and respect existing roles and processes, or at least doing that initially. And I think that's quite distinctive from things like Scrum or SAFe or any of those other things. And even to a certain extent, XP, where, you know, for example, Scrum says that you should have a Scrum Master and a product owner and development team. So in a number of organizations, those roles don't exist and people don't know how to behave in those roles. So actually trying to start Scrum, you know, even though Scrum seems quite simple once you're used to it, starting it, if you're not used to it, actually raises the bar up quite high. I really like this start with where you are right now with Kanban, because it starts to lower the bar to entry. And it also means that you can really apply this to any other services as well. It's not just technology, even though David's subtitle of his book was called Successful Evolutionary Change for Your Technology Business. He kind of regrets that, I think, now. And I think in one sense that's where they were, and the evolution is that we found in the Kanban community, it's not just for a technology business. You can do this with other types of businesses or other areas in your business. Like, you know, a lot of people like myself have done this with marketing teams, HR teams, those kind of things. You just use the same sort of principles. Things like start with where you are right now, and you can start to make progress. The next part is to gain agreement to pursue improvement through evolutionary change. It's really not too hard to do that in most cases, because evolutionary change is not seen as a direct threat to things like roles and responsibilities and what people actually do. So again, the initial resistance to Kanban is quite low, particularly when you use these approaches to evolutionary change that Kanban has built into it, and you try and make sure that the folks that are involved are actually aware of this is how it's going to work. Okay, and the third one is encourage acts of leadership at all levels, which is really, really important. So I think you have to have a lot of great vision and courage to execute a number of changes like this. But that can be seen at all levels. It doesn't necessarily have to be just at the upper echelons of management. It can, I like to think of, you know, even people in teams, being also able to show leadership. You know, even people who are individual contributors can also show acts of leadership. I did have a question on the chat room there from John, and he asked, can you contrast Kanban to squad in the context of IT teams? Yeah, okay. So squad is, it's another word for team, really. It's a group of people working with a shared goal, effectively. So it's really an organizational structure, whereas Kanban's not an organizational structure. It's a management method. So it's really quite distinct from the term squad. I think if you're using the term squad, you might be thinking of what was originally termed, what was it? Help me out here, folks. It's the, what is it? The music groups. Spotify model. Yeah, that's what it was. The Spotify model that not even Spotify really use anymore when you talk to people from Spotify. You know, so I think, you know, that's another example of evolution, is that's where they were at a point in time and they've moved on. Yeah, so I think it's quite different from squads. Okay, so there are three basic approaches to evolutionary change here. So start with what you do right now, agree to pursue incremental or evolutionary change, and acts of leadership, really all important. I've got blog posts on each of these things as well. All right, the next thing I'd like to cover off is the Kanban practices. And this is really the bulk of what the talk is all about. So I'm going to be talking a lot more detail about what the Kanban practices are. There's also values and a few other things, but I just want to give you a sense of the practices first. And then hopefully you'll be able to start to relate what you do with Kanban. So you'll see there's a list of 6 things. So Visualise is obviously at the top. Limit WIP, manage flow, make policies explicit, feedback loops, and improve and evolve. So I think back when I started, I don't think there were actually 6. I think there might have even been just the 3, and the other 3 were maybe made up as part of the other 3 at the bottom, at the top, sorry. But obviously these things have evolved, and we've tried to make these a little bit more explicit and call them out. Because if you get more and more knowledge into the depths of these things, is that you'll see there's different aspects to each of these practices that you can evolve and use, at different maturity levels, and you can continue to evolve up the maturity level with each of these different aspects. So although these are areas of practice, there are different forms to these practices, and I'll talk through a few of those with some examples. So Visualise, here's your classic visualization that you see in Kanban quite a lot. Where you've got some backlog or even an options list. I prefer to use the term options a lot more nowadays. There might be a to-do or next bucket. You've got development, testing, deployment. Obviously, this is a technology example, since a lot of teams that I relate to are in technology, but you could do something similar for a marketing example as well. Just the names on the columns or the number of columns might be a bit different. And you can see here there's a number of things going on this slide. So I'll just go through each of them in turn. So like what we're trying to do here is focus on the whole value stream if you can. Now, what you might want to do is sometimes you don't have enough breadth of view across the whole value stream, at least initially. So sometimes you might want to cordon off what's your immediate sphere of control, or even a little bit further, maybe just sphere of influence, if you know where each of things come from and go to. But often when you start with this, it might be in the context of your team. So just think of it, where does your team take its input from? Where does the output go, kind of thing. But ideally, you want to try and look at a whole value stream, whatever that looks like. Now, the other part that's really, really important is the WIP limits, and I'll talk a little bit more about WIP limits later on, but you'll see that the numbers on the top of the columns here represent the WIP limits. So on the to-do column, there's 2, development column, there's 3, and that 3 applies to both the ongoing as well as done, that kind of stuff. Let's see, what else have we got? We've got a different work type, so you can identify different work types by the different colors. So if you look at on the left in the backlog there's 2 yellow ones and 1 red one. So using colors on a board is a really good way to distinguish between things. So if you've got different work types, a good example of that is a lot of the technology teams we deal with will have project work and support work. So maybe you've got different colors to represent the different types of work. You got little avatars or little tokens for who's working on it. So you can see who's working on what, and if there's stuff there that's not actually being worked on. We've got something there that's got a P1 on it. So that might be a different class of service where, you've probably all seen things like P1 support incidents where it's like, drop everything and fix this because, the website's down, we can't generate new orders or something like that. So that might be a high priority thing that, we might give a different class of service. And I'll talk a little bit more about the policies, and you'll see that the policies themselves are visualized on the board. So what's interesting is that a number of the aspects that I talked about in those earlier practices, visualize, limit, WIP, manage flow to an extent, the explicit policies, those can all be visualized on the board. Okay, so a couple of notes when you're doing a visualization. Of course, this is just a beginner thing. There's there's a lot more that you can learn around, different visualization techniques and how to apply it to a particular context. But I think as a going in position, just assume that there's no standard board design. Try and make the board design fit for the purpose that you're in. Okay, I've got a couple of questions here. I might go to that. Best practice to have multiple boards, i.e. per work stream, or is it acceptable to bundle into one? It's a really good question. Sometimes you might start with different boards, one per work stream. You may have one that maps the overall. I really like Klaus Leopold's work on flight levels. I'll see if I can put something in here. So if you Google Klaus Leopold.
Can do it if you like.
Yeah, thanks, Silke. Yeah, all right, it's up there. But if you Google Klaus Leopold and the flight levels, that's really a good one to look at, where he gives good examples where you can have one high level board. So here's a big, like, let's say it's a project and there's a bit of work going to team A and a bit of work going to team B, and team A and B also have separate boards. So having multiple boards can be pretty useful. I'd say it's hard to give one hard and fast rule. I think adapt it to your context, which the things that make sense in the context. But also quite often, I like Klaus's ideas there, because they really do they really do give some insight into different levels of abstraction and how to model boards at those different levels. Okay, will the definition of done already work instead of a separate done column at each step? I like that question. Thanks, Krishna. Having a definition of done is good, but what's useful here is, okay, I'll go back to that. The definition of done is up there, but what's good here is that, for example, the folks that are doing the testing can see something in development that's done, so they can see what's available to pull through the work stream next. Yeah. Whereas having it all lumped into one, they're not exactly, the board's not telling them what's able to be pulled through the system. So you'll see that over time, Kanban, with the use, I'll talk about WIP limits in a minute, but with the use of WIP limits and these sort of board designs, enable a pull system of work. And one of the reasons behind that is to make sure that teams and the people in the teams aren't overburdened with too much work, is that they're doing the work based upon their capacity and ability to be able to do it. Okay. Another good technique is to put up data near the boards, so that you can relate that data to the conversation around what's going on the boards. And boards can be physical or electronic. Obviously, in today's environment, the electronic boards are really, really valuable. And quite often they can give you, one of the beauties of, two of the good things of electronic boards. One is that they can be accessed by anyone around the world and anyone can get the view of what's going on. The other is that they have, because they're in computers, they've got a really simple capability to generate the data for you. Whereas physical boards, on the other hand, are really good because people have that tactile experience. You can see and feel something move. And it engages people a lot more, I think, than the electronic boards. It's really easy for people to get involved and start to use them. And you can customize them a whole lot more. Okay, so, if you're, some of the specialist electronic boards for Kanban, like LeanKit and Swift and Kanbanize, are some examples. And they have a lot of the Kanban features built into them. If you're using something else like Jira, their Kanban implementations usually quite immature, and you have to do a lot of, so for example, in Jira, you can't have this ongoing and done column necessarily with a WIP limit above it from development. Like, you can't do this in Jira.
What's your favorite electronic tool for Kanban, Daniel?
Well, I'd use any of those three that I mentioned. So Swift Kanban's one I use personally myself a lot more. Lean Kit was one of the early ones, and it's still very good. And Kanbanize some other neat features in it.
Okay. Thank you.
So they're all very good. Okay. Silke, do you mind putting the names of those into the meetup group for folks while I keep going, please? Oh, okay, Michael's done it. Okay.
Michael's just done it already.
Yeah, cool, thanks. All right.
Sorry.
That's great, thanks everyone. I'll move on. So limiting WIP. So WIP stands for work in process, or sometimes people refer to it as work in progress. So the reason why we want to limit work in progress is that that we have a certain capacity. You know, our team, our resources, our people have a finite capacity. I said resources there, and it can be misconstrued, but sometimes there are other resources at play. So, you know, there might be technology resources and other things that we use as part of the knowledge work cycle. So it's not necessarily just technology, but other things. But yeah, our people and our teams in knowledge work have quite a limited capacity, and we want to make sure we don't overburden them with too much work. What you'll find is if you overburden them with too much work, they'll do a lot of context switching and they'll spin their wheels, but they won't actually get anywhere. Okay. So the idea by limiting WIP is to make sure that you can stop starting and start finishing. So you'll actually get a better cycle time through that overall flow. Now, this is an example. On the earlier board, you saw me using the numbers at the top of the column. That's probably one of the better ones, and if you can go straight to that, that's really good. But what you might want to do is limit it by avatar or by token. So on this board, there's only 2 tokens per person, so a person can work on a maximum of 2 things concurrently. Yeah. So that can be useful, but there are limitations to that. So it can be useful to get things going, but there are certain limitations to it. So, for example, you know, I could work on something, I could start something here and then pull something else off and move my token to that. So you've got to make sure that people aren't, you know, starting something and then moving their token to something else before it's finished. So that's that. Here's another one, swim lanes. So you can see now there's horizontal swim lanes across the board here. So there's a limit of 4 stories going through development, testing and deployment. So once one of these things free up, then G can come in and start to be developed. Now this is very useful because it shows you what Kanban's all about. The Kanban shows you the slot that's available, the capacity that's available to do the work. Now, what's interesting here is, although this is really useful, and particularly in understanding how Kanban works, is one of the times when I first did this, it was about 2012. And what I found was that when you use swim lanes like this, quite often these swim lanes get baked into the process. And in my example that I used, that literally did happen, because it was a long hot summer and we put this tape on the window, and you know, in Melbourne, you know, you get those 40-degree days, and after a summer of that, the tape stuck to the window. We couldn't get it off. So we couldn't really change the WIP limits that easily because the tape was stuck on there. You know, we couldn't. So that's the downside to the swim lanes, is that it gets a lot harder to be able to evolve. So, you know, if you increase your development capacity without increasing the testing capacity, you can't balance that out. Okay. All right. There's some questions there. Did you mention Nave? Haven't tested it, but worthwhile mentioning. Yeah, Nave is useful if you've, it's got all the reporting stuff that you want out of it. So if you're getting data, sort of Kanban data reports, and you've got things like Jira that are not good at doing that sort of thing, then it's a great plugin for doing that. Michael asks, is there a benefit of taking the swim lanes back to the to-do column? Possibly, but you might want to put another WIP limit on the to-do column. It just depends on the situation.
There was another question a little bit a while back from Puneet. Do we do estimations like story points, etc. in Kanban?
Oh, okay. Sorry,
that's a little bit further up, but not to forget.
I didn't see that. Thanks for pointing that out. Kanban doesn't stop you from doing it, but there's also there's been a growing interest in the Kanban community to avoid waste in the system, and quite often, sometimes some teams have found that the estimation is waste, and once they understand things like throughput, WIP limits, and lead time, they can generally get a good understanding of how long something's actually going to take. Okay, there's a couple more questions there. Swim lanes for short-term projects or customer. So yeah, you can do that. You can use swim lanes for that could be different work types, Michael. So you can use different swim lanes for that. That's fine. And you can limit your capacity in your swim lanes as well. So you might only want to do 2 short-term projects or take on 2 customers concurrently or something like that, because you don't have capacity to do more. Can you use metrics to track progress? Yes, Raymond, I'll get to that in a moment. Sometimes there's a big lag between development, testing, and deployment. How do you make sure everyone has something to do if you are limiting the slots? That's interesting because I have this question a lot with teams, and it assumes that there's always going to be a bridge or a divide between those skill sets. So quite often people can start to challenge those silos a little bit with the Kanban system and start to help people out on the other sides of those fences. And so hopefully, hopefully the team focus on getting things done rather than just getting my bit done, if that makes sense. That's one of the changes that we like to catalyze. All right, Michael was also talking about Monte Carlo simulations. That's for one of the more advanced sessions, so I'll just leave Monte Carlos out for now. Okay, and Krishna asks, is there a formula to set WIP limits? It depends. I know it's something on team size. Yeah, it is generally a representation of what capacity you have to do work. So the team size will factor into it. There's nothing to say absolutely that if you have 3 developers, you should have a WIP limit of 3. I've had 5 developers before and set the WIP limit to 3 because I wanted to encourage pairing and code reviews and other types of things. So there's no one formula, but what I'd say is when you first start to use WIP limits, you may need to adjust up or down because your first guess, which is what it's going to be, might be wrong, unless you have a real good set of data to say otherwise. But yeah, base it on what you think your team's capacity is. Cool. I might move on because I talked a bit about virtual. So virtual is where you've got the numbers at the top. Michael's asking, can any of the digital tools enforce WIP limits? Some of them give you a warning once you've gone over the WIP limit. Others give you a warning before you're about to go over the WIP limit and potentially prevent you from moving things in, but there's usually overrides that let you pull it in anyway. All right, managing the flow. So this is really important because it's sometimes I've seen even in Scrum teams and other teams like that is that, and if anyone's seen my talk on Scrum and Kanban, you might remember this, is that sometimes there's quite often a lot of bottlenecks in the flow in Scrum teams. And you'll see that, on day 8 or 9 or even day 10 of a 2-week sprint, you'll see everything go over the line from development to testing or something like that, and then the testers freak out. and all that sort of thing. So what we want to try and do is make sure that the overall flow is quite balanced. Look for where the bottlenecks are in the system. Sometimes there are data aspects that can help you with that. Balancing input and output. Yeah. So if your output is, 5 stories a week, why are you taking in 10 stories a week? Yeah. Make sure your input and output is balanced and matches. And the other thing is, are we balancing our risk correctly? So the other thing is, you can come back to things like what Michael was asking, how do we, maybe we limit WIP based upon projects or other things with swim lanes. So there might be different ways that you can visualize the different risks in the swim lane so that you balance it accordingly. So you're not doing too much of one type and none of another. So that you've got a bit of a balanced portfolio, if you like, of risk. Thanks, Ilka. All right. So what is lead time? So there's a couple of different types of lead time. I like to think of this as system lead time. So how long it takes to get across the team's board. So I think of that as a system of work. So how long it takes to get from backlog to do through to development. Now, I think there might have been a question of around to do. So to do is just, these are the next items that we're going to select or commit to and to start to work on. So the lead time is basically what it takes to get from, the left-hand side to the right-hand side, usually to the first unbound queue. And in this example, we've got development with a queue, no WIP limit there. It's basically infinite, which means there could be 1,000 things in the deployment column. Yeah. So that usually what we do is we measure the lead time to the point of the either done if you've got WIP limits all the way across, which is the ideal, or the first unbound queue. Because being unbound, it's completely unpredictable. It could be 1, it could be 1,000. Okay, and there's also the concept of customer lead time. So that when people were talking before about multiple boards, and how I said the overall board might relate to work from team A and team B, and the overall customer lead time is when what Mary and Tom Poppendick would call concept to cash. Yeah, is when you can actually get it out to your customers giving you a request to when you've finally serviced them and delivered them their value. There are other things. I really like this chart. It's probably a bit more advanced than what you might want in a beginner's thing, but I really like it because it's come out of one of Troy McGuinness's spreadsheets, and I've got a link to his repository at the end of this. And it's net flow per week. So when you've got something in red, it means you've started more items than you've finished. When you've got something in green, it means you've finished more items than you've started. When it's at 0, it means you've got a balance. Yeah. So if you get too much red, it means you're taking on too much WIP. You've got to choke the input a bit, make sure the team can get through what's in the system. When you've got lots of green, it means the system's emptying and the team might be starving for work soon. So you got to kind of keep your eye on it and make sure that you've got a balance, because it's economically detrimental to an organisation to have a team sitting there doing nothing. Okay. So it's a continual balancing act. Here's another view of similar kind of data. So, you look at some weeks and there's 3 items coming in and 6 going out, and then another week it's 10 going in and 12 coming out. So, more than, in some cases, double, so is it really regular or is it sporadic, looking at the nature of the work as well. And in knowledge work, it's not always going to be the same old thing over and over again. It's often going to be different things. So you will see a variance. Another thing on managing flow is about risk. Now, I won't go into too much detail, but I mentioned earlier, that P1 thing. So you might give a P1 support incident or something like that a high priority because, your website's down and you can't generate revenue. So class of service is along those lines. It relates to cost of delay and all of those kinds of things. It's to give a really simplistic view of it. It's a way of prioritizing the work in the flow, and giving the team some policies around. Remember when I said, okay, if you get a P1, it's a drop everything and fix this now. So that's like a policy that you want to make explicit. Make sure the team know that they should drop everything and deal with this, or whatever the policy is. Maybe some of those items can be left for a little while and just dealt with as needed. So yeah, class of service is a way of prioritizing the work. Puneet asks, how do we calculate cycle time or lead time if there are different types of work items which mostly take a different amount of time? So what I'd say, Puneet, is when you're recording the cycle time, make sure you record which work item type it is it A, B, or C? And there are other graphs that I haven't gone through because we don't have enough time today. There are other graphs like the cycle time or lead time histograms that you can use, but they should be based on a work item type. Is a good idea to use it per work item type, so you understand how long it takes for that work item type to come through the system. Cool. Explicit policies. This is really simple, but sometimes it's really hard. It can be really hard. Is that that just putting a card on the wall that says, okay, development done means 1, 2, 3, and 4. And don't make it a massive, pre-flight checklist that's as long as my arm. Make sure it's, a few dot points, a few things, so that when you're moving the card across the board, you just do a little spot check. So you just lift your head, look at that policy. Have I done this? Yep. Okay. I can move it. Or no, actually we missed this. Okay. Let's make sure we get that done before we move it across. So those are the policies. And usually the downstream processes help define what's needed. So for example, make sure you talk to your testers about what dev done really should mean, because they're the ones that are going to need that item and have things that they need in place so they can use it. Okay, so the dev done might mean something along the lines of the build's passed and it's available to be deployed to test, or something like that. Okay. All right. Feedback loops. I won't go through these in too many detail, but I just wanted to touch on these different feedback loops that we have in Kanban. So I'll start down the bottom. The orange ones, these are the very basic ones. So if you're going to look at starting things, these are good things to start with. Replenishment, which is just, okay, we've got some capacity this week or this month or whatever your time frame is. What item should we pull in next? And there's another one there called the Kanban meeting. You guys might know this as the daily stand-up. In wherever you're from, Scrum has its daily Scrum meeting. Although quite often in Kanban it's run differently. So Scrum, you'll get what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? What are your blockers? Quite often in Kanban as you walk the board from right to left. And I wrote some blog posts about right to left as well that you can look at as in relation to this. But basically you start at the column that's next to done and you go, is there anything we can pull to done? Or, so can we deploy anything? Can we look at testing? Can anyone help fix the bugs that are blocking this thing? Development, can anyone do code reviews or build this thing? And then as a last resort, you pull in a new ticket. So generally you work from right to left and focus on getting things done. And delivery planning is about, making sure that you're getting prepped for delivering that service to your customer. And there might be things that you do in delivery planning that mean you up or down a class of service of something to fit it in to the delivery planning window. The other three green ones, they're stuff that I cover in what I call the KMP2 class, which is the Kanban Management Professional. So it's more advanced. So that's more on service delivery review, operations review, and risk reviews. So this is where you get into more detail around, fit for purpose services and how you can come to deal with that, and strategy reviews. So don't cover that so much in the basic Kanban courses. It gets covered in the ESP courses later on. But basically it's around making sure the company strategy flows all the way through the various systems so that people can link up what they're doing. You know, so from the daily replenishment meeting, you're pulling something that's relevant to the strategy. All right, so there's some questions there. I'll just take a moment. In Scrum, productivity is measured in velocity. How is that in Kanban? So you might want to look at things like throughput and lead time. Those are very important metrics that we use in place of velocity. Now, a distinction with those two things versus velocity. A velocity is usually you estimate the story points, for example, on a card. So it's what we guess we think we might be able to do, whereas throughput and velocity is what we actually did. Okay.
Daniel, can I elaborate my question actually?
Yeah.
My question is about like let's say there is a new feature, and the product owner asked me like how long will this take? So based on the velocity, it takes another 3 sprints of worth of work. So we're gonna deliver after end of third sprint. So how do we calculate or estimate that work in Kanban?
You can do it in the same way if that's what you're doing. So remember to start with where you are right now.
Mm-hmm.
If that's working for you, don't change it. Okay. There might be something that works better around lead time, and it's probably a more detailed conversation than a just beginners class. But yeah, if you wanted to talk about that offline, Krishna, just ping me and we can have a chat.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Daniel.
Okay. What's the recommended frequency? All right. So usually the Kanban meeting's held daily. That doesn't necessarily mean that you absolutely always have to. That's probably the one thing that, probably the one thing about this thing is there might be recommendations as to when you might make these frequencies, but it depends on your Kanban system. So when we go through this in our Kanban system design class, we look at what makes sense in terms of replenishment. So different contexts, different things will make sense. So in some contexts, doing it daily makes absolute sense. In other contexts, doing it monthly makes much better sense. So there might be things like, you know, what's the nature of the work, the frequency of you know, how long you learn about changes, and you know, what's your ability for your customer to actually accept delivery. You know, so if they're not accepting delivery regularly, then maybe you don't need to replenish regularly. Yeah. So there's no one hard and fast rule there. It depends on your context. So, but there are some, I guess, some guidances like that you know, you've got to think about what it is in your context. And so I won't go into too much more detail on that, but it is contextually sensitive. Hopefully I've answered that, Abdullah. Give me a shout otherwise if not. Okay, so
thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so improve and evolve. So continuous improvements by the teams, which is Kaizen, and then occasionally, you know, to improve larger systemic bottlenecks, you're going to need some higher management intervention is required, which is what we call kaikaku, or, you know, those are some Japanese terms. But, you know, both are possible in Kanban. Quite often we lean towards the Kaizen, but obviously, you know, it's a management method. We know managers have to step in and make those systemic changes at times. Okay, and use the feedback loops to help generate those improvements. So you'll see later on the service delivery review, the ops review, and the risk review, a lot of improvements come through those different cadences. All right. We're getting close to the end. So to get started, implement static, which is a systems thinking approach to introducing Kanban. So I won't go into any detail about that now, but you can just look up static, and I cover that off in some other blogs and other courses and things like that. And there's plenty of material, and David touches on it in his book, and there are a couple of other books that touch on it as well. Okay, but that's how you get started. It's the systemic way of introducing Kanban. That's really all I have for you today, because we have just about hit our hour. I'm just going to go to further information, and then if Ian says that we've got some time, we'll go to extra questions. So here I've got a bunch of books that I've referenced. The first one there is Essential Kanban Condensed. You can actually get an electronic copy of that for free, if you like. Yeah, and Troy's spreadsheets that I mentioned are there as well. So if you want to learn more, a lot of what I've talked about here today, I've covered off in my Kanban blogs. So if you look under my blog page here at Kanban, you'll find more information about it. And then finally, the Kanban community as well is evolving, and we're for the first time offering virtual classes. So this is my first offering of the Team Kanban practitioner on the virtual class. So if you're interested in learning more about the basics, this is a one-day course that's going to be on a Saturday. So if you do have work commitments, you can work around them. So are there any certification societies globally? So Kanban University, which is where a lot of trainers like myself and Silka as well work through, is the main known body throughout the world of Kanban where we do certifications. So this particular course gives you the Team Kanban practitioner, but there's also others like the Kanban Management Professional Credential that we also have, which is 2 courses. Okay, so I think that's all. Ian, do we have time to open it up to any more questions, or are we just about out?
I think what we'll do is we'll stop the recording so that the recording doesn't look too long online, and then we can carry on, just have a chat. Whoever wants to stick around can carry on. Daniel, if you've got a few minutes, stick around, I'll answer more questions.
Yep.
So thanks very much, Daniel. That was awesome. I'm just going to unmute everybody, and you can say thank you, Daniel, and then I'll stop the recording, but stick around afterwards. Daniel.
Thank you, Daniel.
I think I have to be careful about the left join. Let me just check. When I link this,
Thanks, Daniel.
When I join to 1, it's going to join 1.
Someone's on a phone call.
It might
okay, I'll stop the recording now.
Let me just check. It has to be left join, because if